for coming today. Today's lecture recital is going to be a historical overview of Rachmaninoff's Fourth Concerto, followed by a performance of the 1941 revised version, which will be assisted by Dr. Tali Margulies. Rachmaninoff's Fourth Concerto is an anomaly in his output. It is a mystery whether the work was largely produced in Russia or America. Therefore, it is hard to make a claim as to which musical and extra-musical influences pre- and post-immigration contributed to the aesthetic. In addition, it was revised twice by the composer in an attempt to make it more accessible to audiences. Despite these revisions, it remains the least accessible of Rachmaninoff's 5 works for piano and orchestra. Therefore, the question must be asked, were the revisions successful? What is mystifying is that the composer did not at any point in the revision process seem to question that the distinct contrast in style between the previous concertos and the fourth may have contributed to public dissatisfaction. The conspicuous lack of soaring melodies in exchange for highly motivic and rhythmically complex writing surely was unexpected and disappointing to audiences who were accustomed to the heightened romanticism of the previous concertos. Just when the work was written remains open to debate. Evidence exists both for its composition before immigration and after, and it seems that we may never know definitively one way or the other. Because no definitive answers have been reached, it is interesting to ponder the musical and extra-musical influences that may have contributed to the compositional style, and to engage in the exercise of viewing the work as either American, Russian, or a mixture of both cultures, based on its internal details. In the second part of today's talk, I will outline the interaction between the reception of the fourth and the composer's subsequent revisions. I will pose the question whether the artistic value of the work was increased or decreased by the revisions, and if the latter is true, how the composer might have altered the work, if at all, had he recognized that length was not the issue, but rather a stylistic departure that confounded audiences. Rachmaninoff was famously secretive about his work, and the Fourth Concerto is no exception. The composer does not indicate in his correspondence an exact or even approximate commencement date of his work on the concerto. In fact, the only solid piece of primary evidence in existence is his indication on the autograph manuscript, in which he reveals that he started the work on the piece in New York in 1925 and completed the concerto in Dresden in 1926. However, this does not seem to reflect actual events, as several sources suggest that the composer produced a draft prior to his emigration to the US, even as early as 1913. Perhaps the most convincing document is a sketchbook containing part of the first and last movements. The fragments are not dated, but the sketchbook contains a setting from the choral work St. John's Gospel, which is dated November 1914. It is assumed the portions of the concerto are from approximately the same date. In addition, his 1914 correspondence reveals that he was struggling to produce a large work at this time. Rachmaninoff would make annual retreats to Ivanovka, his country estate, where he would routinely produce his most significant works. But in 1914, he remained there for an unusually long period, and unlike previous years, did not return with a completed large work. His correspondence sheds light on this lack of productivity. In a 1914 letter to Alexander Goldenweiser, he states, "The summer has passed, and for me it passed badly. I was very busy until the 15th of June, but the whole time my work did not get along." Half a decade later, it is also possible that Rachmaninoff is referring to the concerto in a letter to his friend Nikita Morozov. Having just emigrated to the US in 1919, Rachmaninoff states, "I am not drawn to composition, or only rarely drawn. The latter happens when I think about the 2 large compositions of mine I began not long before leaving Russia. When I think of these, I long to finish them." Another valuable testimony that indicates work began prior to his emigration comes from the composer's close friend confidant Nikolai Medtner. In a 1924 letter to Goldenweiser, Medtner states that Rachmaninoff had drafted the fourth in 1917. In his biography, Rachmaninoff, composer, pianist, conductor, Barry Martin proposes an interesting theory that the concerto shares similar stylistic features to works produced in 1909 to 1914, in particular the 1913 Second Piano Sonata. In addition to the highly motivic writing and increased rhythmic complexity, he makes the observation that the quasi-improvisational opening of the Second Sonata is very similar to the opening of the second movement of the concerto. Martin also observes that there is an additional passage in the finale after the development which recalls an episode of the 1913 version of the Second Sonata. This passage even shares the same key. From a structural perspective, Martin argues that the manuscript of the Fourth Concerto is very close to the Third Piano Concerto, which was produced in the summer of 1909. For this reason, he concludes that the Fourth was drafted soon after. Martin is equally convinced that the second theme of the first movement is a close cousin of the 1910 F major prelude. Rachmaninoff scholar Max Harrison also recognizes the similarity with works produced just prior to the composer's immigration. He states that the refinement of orchestration is similar to that seen in the Bells of 1913, and the use of short thematic motifs and strong rhythmic figures was seen in the 1910 Opus 32 preludes. At the same time, Harrison says that although a continuity in style is evident between pre-immigration works and the Fourth Concerto, the thin textures of the concerto are a new stylistic feature in contrast to the rich sonorities of the 1917 Opus 39 etudes. The Fourth Concerto even quotes material from the pre-immigration period, specifically the 1914 Opus 33 Etude Tableau. A passage from the C minor etude appears in the middle movement of the concerto. Interestingly, Rachmaninoff chose to withhold the C minor etude from the 1914 publication of the Opus 33 set. It is therefore assumed by Barry Martin and others, including biographer Max Harrison, that the most likely explanation was that Rachmaninoff was saving the passage for the concerto. This suggests that Rachmaninoff had begun work on the slow movement prior to the 1914 publication of the Opus 33 etudes. Lastly, corroborating the evidence thus far, two articles were published in the Russian periodical Musica from 1914 and 1917, stating Rachmaninoff was working on a fourth concerto. As can be expected, the revolutionary year 1917 was a traumatic time for Rachmaninoff. His Ivanovka estate was seized by the government, and the political tensions surrounding the socialist regime found the composer struggling to keep his family safe and financially afloat. Amid the political turmoil, Rachmaninoff was offered a Scandinavian recital tour. Using it as an excuse to obtain permits for the Rachmaninoff family to leave the country, he accepted immediately. And on the 22nd of December 1917, he and his family left St. Petersburg. During the Scandinavian tour, Rachmaninoff received 3 significant job offers from the US, including a recital tour and conducting contracts with the Cincinnati and Boston Symphony Orchestras that he subsequently declined. The composer did not have fond memories of his past engagements in the US. But as he continued to struggle to support his family through composition alone, he soon began to consider the US as financially advantageous. In November 1918, the Rachmaninoffs left Norway bound for New York City. Upon arrival in the US, Rachmaninoff was quickly engaged for 36 performances for the upcoming 1918 to 1919 concert season. Rachmaninoff concertized for 8 subsequent years and composed very little during this time. Max Harrison suggests that taking a break from composition was a necessary decision to allow the composer time to acclimate to his new environment. Although he did not produce a single original work, Rachmaninoff wrote a handful of transcriptions during these years, including Fritz Kreisler's Liebeslied of 1921 and Liebesfrei of 1925. He also worked on a cadenza to Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, the manuscript of which is a valuable document in the history of the Fourth Concerto. On the back of a draft of the 1919 Liszt cadenza exists a fragment of the last movement of the concerto. We can therefore assume that Rachmaninoff was working sporadically on the concerto during this hiatus period. Further evidence of this is a sketchbook dated 1921 to 1922 given to Alexander Zloty by the composer that contains parts of the first and third movements of the concerto. In 1925, by cutting his 8th season short, Rachmaninoff made a very deliberate decision to return to composition, specifically to work on the Fourth Piano Concerto. Biographers cite several reasons for his return to composition beyond Rachmaninoff's natural inclination to compose. Harrison suggests that Rachmaninoff was bored with performing the second and third concertos and needed a new vehicle. Martin reveals that Medtner, the concerto's dedicatee, may have motivated Rachmaninoff to return to composition at this time. In an April 1924 conversation between Medtner and Rachmaninoff, Medtner asked Rachmaninoff why was he not composing, and Rachmaninoff famously responded, "How can I compose without melody?" Perhaps the sense of unfulfillment brought on by this interaction motivated Rachmaninoff to return to composition, because he wrote Medtner 2 months later with the news that he had begun composing. We know from the autograph manuscript, which is marked New York, January 1925, Dresden, August 1926, that Rachmaninoff began the final stage in piecing together the concerto in 1925 in his West End Avenue apartment before completing the manuscript in Dresden in August 1926. However, Rachmaninoff's first reference to the Fourth is only after its completion. Upon receiving the printed copy, he wrote to Medtner in August 1926, expressing his concerns over its length, jokingly remarking that it would have to be performed over several nights like the Ring cycle. This was obviously not a passing comment, because prior to the 1926 premiere, Rachmaninoff brought the printed score to Cannes on vacation and made some unspecified cuts. The work's premiere took place in Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Orchestra under Leopold Stokowski on March 18, 1927, with Rachmaninoff as soloist. He performed it 2 more times in Philadelphia and proceeded to introduce the work to New York, Washington, and Baltimore. The reception was very poor. Critics described the work as a relic of the 19th century, with one critic calling it long-winded, tiresome, unimportant, and in places tawdry. In March 1927, Samuel Shotsanov gave the following unenthusiastic review. When Mr. Rachmaninoff last night launched into his Fourth Concerto, the first theme, after a few introductory measures, seemed like an assurance that the eminent Russian was only taking up a thread where he had left off. All seemed so right and true for the moment. Here were the same characteristics: the vaulted architecture of phrase, the undercurrent of romantic sadness, the harmonic solidity. But as the movement progressed, the artistic tension began slowly to relax. Suddenly, parts did not attain a natural fusion. New material appeared without the sanction of a musical necessity. Piano and orchestra went skirmishing afield. One's attention began to wander. The first movement came to a close with unexplained abruptness. One's hopes were centered on the largo. Rachmaninoff is always at home in slow movements in which his long, supple melodies have luxuriantly, albeit with aristocratic dignity. But the melody of the largo of the new concerto was not even characteristically Rachmaninoff. It was reminiscent, but only, of Schumann's Piano Concerto, the opening theme of which appeared in the Rachmaninoff like a pale emanation of itself. The last movement had even fewer moments of inspiration than the preceding 2, and left one with the impression that a lot was said, but not of any particular importance. Also in March 1927, Lawrence Gilman, music critic for the New York Herald Tribune, wrote, "For all its somewhat naive camouflage of whole tone scales and occasionally dissonant harmony, Mr. Rachmaninoff's new concerto remains as essentially 19th century as if Tchaikovsky had signed it. Somber it is at times, but it never exhibits the fathomless melancholy of such authentic masters of tragical speech as Mussorgsky. There is a Mendelssohnian strain in Rachmaninoff which relates him more intimately to the salon than to the steps. And this strain comes out in his new concerto, as it does in all his music, sooner or later. The new work is neither so expressive nor so effective as its famous companion in C minor, nor is it so resourceful in development. There is thinness and monotony in the treatment of the thematic material of the slow movement, and the finale begins to weary before its end. The imposing, the seductive Rachmaninoff is still the unashamed and dramatizing sentimentalist of the second concerto." One of the most negative reviews came from Pitt Sanborn, who likened the concerto to salon music in his March 1927 review, posted in the Evening Telegram. He writes, "The concerto in question is an interminable, loosely knit hodgepodge of this and that, all the way from Liszt to Puccini, from Chopin to Tchaikovsky. Even Mendelssohn enjoys a passing compliment. The orchestral scoring has the richness of Nuga, and the piano part glitters with innumerable stock tricks and figurations. As music, it is now weepily sentimental, now of an elfin prettiness, now swelling toward bombast in a fluent orotundity. It is neither futuristic music nor music of the future. Its past was a present in the continental capitals half a century ago. Taken by and large, and it is even longer than it is large, this work could fittingly be described as super salon music. Mademoiselle Cécile Chaminade might have safely perpetrated it on her third glass of vodka." One suspects that even Medtner was not entirely convinced that the concerto was Rachmaninoff's work. In his 1925 correspondence with Golden Visor, although he stated that it was, of course, the same authentic Rachmaninoff, he avoided giving his opinion, saying, "Rachmaninoff played it too fragmentarily and too little of it to make a proper judgment." Also, a close friend, Russian composer and musicologist Alfred Swan, criticized the work for its lack of spontaneity. It seems the criticism of this manuscript version has not lessened over time. Rachmaninoff scholar Geoffrey Norris states his reservations in a 1976 biography, recognizing that although the concerto was structurally very similar to the second and third concertos, he believes the fourth lacks luster due to the absence of strong melodic themes. Similar to Norris, Barry Martin criticized the work's melodic content, though both biographers commend the opening theme. Although Martin views the fourth as a significant and important work worthy of the concert stage, he nonetheless takes a critical view of the piece. He provides a detailed critique in his biography of the composer, scrutinizing the work movement by movement. Although he celebrates the conviction of the opening, he goes on to say that the rest of the concerto does not live up to the promise of the first theme, and describes the bridge passage that follows as musically flaccid. He also perceives the work's coda as much too abrupt, and finds the 3/4 time signature awkward, considering that it occurs nowhere else in the movement. Martin describes the Largo movement as another enigma. He criticizes the main theme, calling it a stunted motto, perfunctory and disappointing, and so different from its long-breathed predecessors. With regard to the finale, Martin takes issue with two aspects of the piece: its empty exhibitionism and its reliance on structural models of the past. He perceives the development as rife with empty decoration and nothing more than an exhaustive exploitation of the first theme. The recycling of former models refers to the finale's climax. Martin believes that an indication that the composer was struggling during the composition process is that Rachmaninoff resorted to reusing a compositional technique borrowed from the third concerto. The build-up to the final climax is achieved by breaking down the second subject into a series of staccato fragments, which he suggests was an effective strategy in the third, but has little effect in the fourth. In spite of his criticism, Martin believes that the work does not deserve its current neglect, saying that the concerto has several moments of real inspiration. He believes that it is a work of considerable originality, but appears to be disappointed that Rachmaninoff chose to write in an unfamiliar vein, so different to the previous concertos. His feelings of disappointment are summarized when he writes that the fourth conspicuously lacks the grandiloquent expression of melancholy of the third and second concertos, and the element of gladiatorial combat between soloist and orchestra. He believes by saying the second subjects of the outer movements lack the climactic apotheosis so attractive in the second and third, and the main theme of the second movement seems to be an almost deliberate antithesis to the great sweeping melodies of earlier years. Not all of the composer's biographers are unenthusiastic about the concerto, however. Max Harrison is an enthusiastic proponent of the piece, arguing that, like other great composers whose style evolved and matured, Rachmaninoff's compositional language, as exhibited in the fourth, became more refined but less accessible, suggesting that Rachmaninoff's newfound esoteric language was mistakenly perceived by audiences and critics as a weakening of creative power. Harrison goes on to say that Rachmaninoff continued to write in his usual romantic style. It would have been an absurd response to the traumatic events that led to his emigration to the US. Harrison further argues that due to the fact that most of the concerto was written in the US, it reflects the cold, harsh reality of the events that led to his relocation, and that the romantic haze had gone forever. In spite of his perhaps flawed understanding of the compositional history of the fourth, Harrison, in contrast to Martin or Norris, appears to have a clearer comprehension of the more esoteric modernistic language. He is not disappointed by the concerto's lack of grandiloquent expression. He believes the evolution of his modern style is not necessarily a heightening of dissonance, but rather the use of elliptical structures and the contrast of elusive and direct statements. The elusive elements which Martin dismisses as inaccessible, Harrison perceives as a more mature side of Rachmaninoff's artistry, insisting that Rachmaninoff got the concerto right the first time, and that the previous revisions did not improve the work. Harrison draws attention to the sharper thematic profiles and the complex neoclassical keyboard and orchestral textures. At this point, it should be mentioned that Rachmaninoff was the only person to perform the manuscript version in the 20th century. The 1926 manuscript version was not published until 2001, whereupon it was recorded with the Helsinki Philharmonic, with Alexander Gindin as soloist and Vladimir Ashkenazy conducting. Ashkenazy gave an interview in the same year, and although somewhat critical, the piano conductor expressed his admiration for the work, stating that he much prefers the manuscript compared to any other version, further declaring that he prefers Rachmaninoff's first thoughts, including the 1913 manuscript version of the second sonata. He believes Rachmaninoff's attempt to make the sonata more compact and more accessible deprives the work of its original spontaneity. The same may be said for the concerto. Although Ashkenazy believes the third movement is not one of Rachmaninoff's best children, due to weak thematic material and the ineffective ending, he concludes that the manuscript is the best version because of the repetition of the second subject, which Rachmaninoff cuts in subsequent revisions. Although he suggests that Rachmaninoff should have rewritten the third movement, he ends the interview stating that he loves the work to bits and pieces. In response to the poor reception of the manuscript version, in the summer of 1928, Rachmaninoff revised the work. He writes, "After 1.5 months of hard work, I have finished the corrections to my concerto. The first 12 pages have been rewritten, and also the whole coda. Rachmaninoff's revision was largely concerned with shortening the piece. We know from his August 1926 letter to Medtner, where he jokingly compared the length of the concerto to Wagner's Recital, that even prior to the poor reception of the manuscript version, Rachmaninoff was concerned with the duration of the work. Also, from the 1926 letter, it appears that Rachmaninoff believed the third movement needed the most cuts. In the same correspondence, he expresses concern that the orchestra never ceases to play, commenting that it is more a concerto for orchestra and piano. He shortened the overall work from 1,016 measures to 902 measures, omitting 21 measures from the first movement, 91 measures from the finale, and just a couple of measures from the middle movement. This was the version published in 1928 as one of the first releases from his daughter's publishing house, Terry. The premiere of the first revision took place in the UK with the BBC Manchester Orchestra, conducted by Sir Henry Wood, with Rachmaninoff as soloist. Again, the reception was poor. Rachmaninoff took his second failure very badly and decided to abandon the work. It wasn't until 13 years later that he decided to revisit the concerto to begin work on a second revision. In 1938, the composer wrote to his friend Evgeny Somov, "This summer, I should also like to correct my fourth concerto, and this would not be difficult for the first two movements. But the catch is in the last movement, where a whole episode has to be recomposed anew, and I don't feel up to that." Again, focused on the length, in the summer of 1941, Rachmaninoff set about reducing the overall work by a further 78 measures, from 902 to 824. He subtracted 33 measures from the opening movement, 3 measures from the largo, and 42 from the finale. Some subtle changes were made to the piano writing and orchestration, but the composer focused most of his attention on making cuts, particularly in the latter half of the finale. The second revision was published in this form posthumously in 1944. The premiere of the second revision took place on 17th of October 1941 in Philadelphia, with the Philadelphia Orchestra, Eugene Ormandy conducting, and Rachmaninoff as soloist. Again, the reception was poor. Rachmaninoff made a recording of the concerto in December 1941, the only recording of the fourth made by the composer, and he resolved to never perform the work again. Out of his entire output, Rachmaninoff made the most thorough revisions to the fourth concerto. It is interesting that he exhibited such tenacity to ensure the success of the work, hoping that restructuring and reorchestration would improve the work's reception, when it seems obvious that the inaccessibility of the musical language compared to its predecessors was the issue. In addition, what is baffling is his emphasis on length, because as Norris points out, each movement of the original version is shorter than respective movements of the third concerto. The more obvious solution would have been to do as Vladimir Ashkenazy suggests and recompose portions of the concerto. That is not to say that public acceptance is the marker of a masterpiece. As Alan Hirschberger writes in his dissertation, Rachmaninoff on Rachmaninoff, an interpretive analysis of his piano orchestra recordings, the fourth is perhaps the most forward-looking of all 5 concertos. Hirschberger believes that the composer was moving in a new direction as exhibited by the austerity and stark beauty of the work. It may have been exactly this austerity and stark beauty that was unappealing to the public. There remain many interesting and ambiguous aspects regarding the compositional history of this work. Moving forward in my research, I plan to investigate the alleged American influences on the concerto, because it is nearly impossible to decipher if the concerto was largely conceived in Russia or the United States. It may be fruitful to analyze the musical content based on both possibilities. The research will be a useful tool to those interested in gaining a more thorough understanding of Rachmaninoff Rachmaninoff's less accessible writing, as exhibited in his fourth concerto. I will now perform the 1941 revised version, the shortest version of all. As I perform, I invite you to ponder some questions that we may have seen are central to the complicated history of the work. Does Rachmaninoff achieve structural cohesion in spite of the significant cuts? How about in the finale, where most of the excision occurred? Does the work seem disappointing compared to his previous concertos? Exactly why? Is the fourth incompatible with Rachmaninoff's lyric style, or is his newfound language based on an economy of resources and principle compatible with it? Lastly, I invite you to decide where you would place the work chronologically within the composer's output. Stylistically, does the work fit more precisely into his pre-immigration period, along with works such as the Second Sonata and Ancient Tableau? Or do you hear a distinct American influence with the inclusion of jazz elements and modernistic tendencies that began to emerge in the States in the first half of the century? Such questions may be ultimately undecidable. Asking them, however, may give us an insight into the position that this work holds.